When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. Debates about free speech and censorship are everywhere. These debates can take place at such a high level and include so many variables like government restrictions, social media ownership, account banning, speakers on college campuses, and much more, that it can be hard to know where to even start to engage this debate. So let's just start with a few examples to illustrate the importance of competition, the value of competition, and separating rational arguments from irrational ones. In 2010, the United States, along with many other countries, sent a delegation to FIFA, soccer's international governing body, to make a case that America should host either the 2018 or 2022 World Cups. Countries with the best cases might base that case on lots of evidence: existing stadiums, transportation and entertainment and dining for lots of fans, safety protocols, viewership, and potential profits. You get the idea. And then you might think that the powers that be, FIFA in this case, would deliberate like a jury on the evidence and determine the best country or countries to host a good World Cup. That's not easy. That might be an arduous, deliberative task, a really tough call. Or, to take a different avenue, members of the jury could secretly advertise their votes as being for sale and set up secret offshore accounts awaiting lots of money and take all kinds of gifts like paintings and vacation homes and award the World Cup to the highest bidder. When Russia and Qatar were awarded the 2018 and 2022 World Cups, that's exactly what other nations feared happened, and that process that was supposed to be public and competitive was in fact corrupt and biased. And story after story, report after report since then has borne out that fear, and the U.S. Justice Department even pursued these claims. Let's take another quick example about the importance of competition in truth-seeking efforts. A very different example. One of the most famous works of muckraking journalism is the example that we're going to pursue. In 1904, Upton Sinclair, working under a fake name, toiled in the dangerous and unsupervised Chicago meatpacking plants. When he later published The Jungle, he based his description of the unsanitary industrial conditions in the source of much of America's meat on his stockyard experiences. The resulting public outcry led to many reforms, including the Meat Inspection Act. In a sense, though, Sinclair's fight for public knowledge, for more voices on this issue, remains. Several U.S. states have passed so-called ag-gag laws, agriculture gag laws, and these are laws that criminalize recording or photographing agricultural facilities in the United States. Well, what ties this issue of football and food together, ultimately, is competition. In one case, there was a fake competition. In another case, there was no competition. The public only got one point of view about safety and cleanliness of food sources. I'm Michael Lee, Professor of Communication and Director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. Our guest today on When We Disagree is Joel Caldwell. Joel is an environmental storyteller, including writing, photography, and filmmaking. He also co-founded the Marsh Project, a grassroots movement to revitalize salt marsh ecosystems in Charleston, South Carolina. Joel, tell us an argument story.
Yeah, so a tiny setup here. I grew up in a very non-confrontational family. You know, arguments were just not our strength. But I think, you know, growing up, I thought it was a strength that we never argued, which I've now realized is probably not a strength. But so the thing that strangely popped into my head, I was walking down a very rainy street in Brooklyn, New York, and I saw in front of me a very affluent appearing man light up a cigarette and toss his empty pack of smokes in the gutter, even though he was just a few feet away from a garbage can. And I just felt my skin crawl. And kind of before I knew what happened, I was 3 strides up. I picked up his pack of cigarettes and I had deposited it in the hood of his jacket, which was underneath his umbrella. And probably had accompanied that with some sort of wild-eyed look because I was very irritated. And then I was sort of gone. But it stuck with me for a while. And I realized how foolish of a story this is in the scheme of life, but it stuck with me for some reason.
You're like the cigarette pack vigilante. What did he do?
I don't know. I was gone.
Oh, you just ran
I
off?
would imagine he was startled. I didn't run off. I just walked down the street and he was behind me.
And he knew that you had done it, though. It
I
wasn't like
assume so, or maybe he got home and he took off his jacket and he found his own
okay.
cigarettes in his hood. That's probably more
I thought
likely
I was
it.
picturing you sort of angrily, aggressively depositing the cigarette pack in the hood.
It was in my probably subdued style. It was angry, but
Got
yeah,
you.
it wasn't like horribly confrontational.
Sure. And you didn't confront him to his face, make eye contact, say, what did you do? Why did you do this?
Right. It was more, I think he'll find his cigarette pack in his hood and maybe connect the dots.
Huh. Is this a pattern? It's confrontational, but it's, there's a little bit of subterfuge, a lot of subterfuge to it. Is this a pattern that you can recognize? Where you go through some of the conflict?
It's not something that I ever do.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not somebody that is like a strange vigilante on the street. This is not something that I do.
Huh.
I think this was a time when I was angrier than I am now. Certainly.
Huh.
I also think that, you know, I grew up in a pretty rural place, a pretty impoverished place, and I think that I probably react more strongly to affluent people doing things that they should know better than than maybe the alternative in my own mind.
Yeah. Talk a bit about the role of class or your identification of class in that moment. Had it been somebody who presented differently, what might have happened?
I'm sure I would have done nothing. You know, I would have probably been irritated by, you know, but I would have justified it in some way in my mind, you know, potentially. But yeah, the fact that it was this very, you know, I felt like this affluent guy who just, in my mind, in the fantasy that was running through my mind in that moment, you know, he thought he could just do whatever he wanted and didn't need to take care of anything.
Yeah. Why do you think this story from 6 or 8 years ago sticks with you so powerfully?
It's interesting, you know. I think for one, I still am a pretty non-confrontational person, so I don't get in a lot of heated arguments. You know, I have friends that would probably have a better story from this week, you know, but personally, that's just kind of my style is not, you know, for better or worse. It's like I don't get into a lot of arguments. You know, I certainly disagree with people, but you know, and it's something that I'm really focused on. I really want to be better at having hard conversations with people who don't see the same, you know, I think just as an environmental storyteller, right? I mean, just preaching to the choir is not very helpful. I'm really interested in how we kind of break down boundaries for a lot of reasons, right? But yeah, I think also, I don't know, that story, I think was sort of a period in my life when I was kind of like, okay, this is not the way to be doing things.
As you talk through this, I'm affected by two things in your storytelling generally, and then your approach to conflict specifically. So you say that you came from a non-confrontational family and that you are now more non-confrontational than you were even in the story you told from 6 or 8 years ago because you're less angry, perhaps? Is that right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's two ways. Like, you know, so I've now been with my wife for probably about 15 years. We've been married for 5 or 6. And she actually had to teach me how to argue, you know, this in the beginning of our relationship, right? If there was any disagreement, which I think is basically fundamental to any relationship, right? If you're going to be with the same person for a long period of time, you kind of have to kind of come to head at times and then talk through it. And that allows you to kind of like continue to grow together, right?
Yeah.
You know, as you age, as you change. And so, but I would, if we got into an argument, you know, I would kind of clam up and just disappear, you know, not physically disappear, but just disappear from the conversation. And that made her crazy because she's from a very different, you know, she's from a very different background. And so in some ways, I think I'm much better at, you know, talking about emotions. I'm you know, I'm not probably winning any records, but I'm able to, or winning any awards, but I'm able to talk about things. I'm able to have disagreements. I'm able to talk through them, but I still, don't have a lot of conflict or confrontation.
Out of curiosity, what's your spouse's name?
Haley.
What did going to Haley's debate camp look like?
Oh gosh. I mean, brutal. Right. I mean, it's like going to the place you never want to go to. Right. I mean, it was just my idea. And I'm certain my parents disagreed. I'm certain they argued, but they, with few exceptions, ever did it in front of us kids. I'm one of 4.
Okay.
It just must have been behind closed doors. Because it was really, so going, you know, in my own relationship, realizing that it doesn't just work like that, you know, was Yeah, super challenging.
Yeah, and debate camp aside, still characterize yourself as relatively non-confrontational, which is an extension of what you say is an old family pattern. And yet you are engaged in work related to public advocacy, storytelling, photography, filmmaking, presumably making arguments in favor of environmental preservation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think I try to do that through kind of more empathetic storytelling, right? So telling
Uh-huh.
story, I love telling stories, through people that I think of as, kind of stereotype busters, right?
Oh,
Like
yeah.
somebody that you see, who knows? It could have been that man that I put the cigarette in his in
Sure.
his
Yeah.
hood, was having a bad day, but he was actually like a really beautiful person, and I just made this snap judgment that was totally inaccurate, But
That's right.
yeah, so I think that's kind of how I approach storytelling and trying to like cross those boundaries.
In your hopes in the Marsh Project, which you run that revitalizes salt marsh ecosystems, and your larger kind of environmental consciousness work, as you're picking these representative anecdotes or examples of people who are stereotype busters, as you say, you're not really explicitly making an argument about that. You're saying, not saying, well, here's Michael Lee and he busts these stereotypes and therefore you should change your belief or get involved in this. You're essentially telling the story, and then what is the hope that the audience will do with that story?
Yeah, I guess you're generally trying to show people that people can identify with, right? So that people can be invited into the conversation, So whatever that conversation might be. So in my instance, lots of times it's environmentally, it's about environmental things, that some segments of the population just don't feel invited into that conversation. So if you can if you can actually find someone that kind of can represent that crowd or that group, I think that enlarges the circle and gets more buy-in.
Yeah. Are there areas of activism generally or environmental activism specifically that you feel like lend themselves best to this kind of storytelling and storytelling as invitation
Yeah,
to participate? Or are there some that lend themselves more to an antagonistic, confrontational style?
for sure. Yeah, and this may not be any surprise, but I I lend away from the confrontational. I'm not the guy that ties myself into a tree so that it doesn't get cut down. Although I have a lot of respect for those people and I care for those trees, right? And
Uh-huh.
I'm glad there's people out there that are doing more like the policing, right? But what we try to do with the Marsh Project and what I do with my own work is certainly much more about the things that individuals can do. That's kind of really been the focus, right? Of can you change what you've planted in your yard? Can you change how you talk to your neighbor? Can you change how you think about, if you just pump the water out into your street and it goes into the storm gutter and out into the marsh, like there's like more like, I think that uh, when we talk about things that we can do versus the things that we can't do,
Mhm.
there's more of an opportunity to engage more people.
Yeah, and implicit in that is a kind of confrontation, which is you're not doing this thing, and perhaps you should.
Truly.
But in your storytelling, your art, your approach to this is more of a subtle nudge
Yeah.
in the direction of a behavioral change rather than shame or
Right. Yeah, we
you're
try.
making the world worse and why don't you get your head out of you know what and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. We try to be fun. We try to be playful. We try to show the fact that like living a more connected life to your environment, to your ecosystem is a better life. It's a more joyful life. It's not the typical story, which in my opinion has been kind of more doom and gloom. If we don't do this, we're going to die. If we don't do this, you're a terrible person, et cetera. It's more about what we're missing out on than what we have to do.
So much of obviously environmental activism and lots of kinds of activism, but we're on the environment, so let's stay there. Lots of environmental activism has a reputation, and at least they get the most media coverage, right? Is because it creates these kinds of image events that really can sell. It can be on the front page of a newspaper, if we take down a whaling vessel or something along those lines. So that's the most extreme antagonistic examples, the folks who are tying themselves to trees and whatnot. But also there is a kind of really aggressive argument style in some environmental activist quarters. And I'm thinking specifically about the most famous case being a film entirely dedicated to rebuttal, which is Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, in which he stood forward, and the film became wildly successful. And the entire film is a case for science-based existence of warming, and then a rebuttal to the specious arguments that come back. And it didn't necessarily move the needle that much. So what do you think is going on with the limits of this kind of activism?
I mean, that might be out of my purview to comment on that. And I mean, I think that the awareness that Al Gore created with that film is massive and was totally necessary. And so I would argue that it did move the needle, maybe, imperceptibly, or maybe there's a groundswell, right, that is unfortunately taking decades. But,
Right,
so
right.
I think it was really powerful and really important.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I guess when it comes to things like this, I don't ever want to be critical of people that dedicate their lives to this. I'm not a proponent of angry activism, but again, that's maybe me coming from some privilege or something, I'm not that angry of a person, but I think we kind of have to hit it from all sides, so we'll try our way. It'd be good if everybody else tries their way as well, so that might've been a bit of a dodge, but
Oh, you're great. Do you think that stories, I'm trying to think about the arguments you're implicitly making. So do the stories that you try to tell, whether it's through photographs, films, writing, etc., is the argument come first? In other words, you have a conclusion that you would like the audience to accept, and then you find an example that proves that? Or is it a story that you just find powerful and you're not really sure exactly what the ends to which it could be used for are, but it's a story that needs to be told?
Yeah, I think there's some of both.
Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of my stuff is...
And give an example if you could.
Yeah, if I come across a great story that also, has great purpose, then it's a total winner, right? So an example would be actually today.
Okay.
I directed a film for Patagonia, and it went live this morning, and it was about, it's a bit of a niche, but hopefully it'll be less so if people watch the film.
Sure.
It's the first people in the United States, or in North America, I should say, to grow their own hemp, process it into usable fiber, and use it in the construction of homes, is the Lower Sioux Indian community on the plains of Minnesota. And they used to have 29 million acres that they followed the buffalo on, and now they live on 3 square miles, and they have a casino and about nothing else. They were subjected to the largest mass execution in U.S. history the day after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed.
Wow.
38 Dakota warriors were hung, signed by Abraham Lincoln.
This is in Mankato.
Exactly. Wow. Exactly. Nicely done.
I spent some time in Minnesota.
Wow. Yeah, and so it's an incredibly powerful story for lots of reasons, in my opinion. It's a powerful story for one, because it talks about the adoption of plant-based building materials and how we can make homes that are carbon banks as opposed to carbon emitters.
Yeah,
it's a powerful story from a social context. It's a powerful story to tell this indigenous-led movement, kind of the resumption of protecting the earth, even though they've been disenfranchised as much as anybody on this continent, so that's an example of, it's just a incredible story that would be worth telling kind of no matter what, but it all comes together really nicely.
Yeah, and it's an amazing story, and I'm glad you gave that example. And it also makes me think about our kind of larger discussion we've been having in this conversation about what confrontation means and what non-confrontation means, because that story, if it's given real amplification and told very well, could be, assuming it's modeled or serves as an inspiration for lots of groups of people, could be threatening to incredibly powerful interests in this country.
Yep.
And so it is a kind of confrontation, and not just a low-key confrontation between you and I, or you and a small community in Minnesota or somewhere, but you and incredibly powerful interests. And so it makes me want to come back to the question of, like, you characterize yourself as non-confrontational and tell this story,
Truly.
And it doesn't seem to match up.
I think I'm not confrontational on the person-to-person context, right? Like, I don't want to sit at Thanksgiving and like have an angry, or even maybe not angry. And I wish I was less, because maybe it's kind of chicken shit of me. I'm not sure. But, I don't really want to sit across from my cousin, who's an ardent supporter of a candidate that I'm not, and have, and kind of like the few hours that I'm going to see this person this year, have a conversation that, you understand what I'm saying?
Clearly,
like, or a conversation that I feel like we're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah.
Not to be, not to think that that's not possible, but, so I guess maybe I pick my battles, and it's more, but I guess all of my work, it would be confrontational from that lens.
Yeah, from that lens. I mean, that is kind of the classic Thanksgiving example. We actually had a really powerful episode on this show about a Thanksgiving argument that really hurt a family. But that is kind of the classic paradigmatic example of folks thinking about confrontation as, I'm locked at Thanksgiving dinner with my uncle who's in QAnon, and I just can't get out of it, and we're just screaming at each other, and that's kind of that, right? But in another sense, you've dedicated much of your professional life to a kind of confrontation. And of course, you've gone to Haley's debate camp, and so you're now
helpful.
You're now well equipped to have more confrontational conversations as opposed to being antagonistic or mean, right?
Right. I think that's true.
Yeah. Okay. So at high level, then, you grow up in a non-confrontational family. You have more healthy confrontations as a result of your loving spouse. You've dedicated your life to what strikes me as, I mean, they could be more aggressive. You could be chaining yourself to stuff and getting arrested and all that sort of stuff. But you've dedicated your professional life to picking on some folks who are incredibly powerful and telling stories that might threaten their interests. And so let's come back to the first statement. It was, do you see yourself as confrontational, non-confrontational?
I see myself as very confrontational. Well said. You really changed the whole way I think about myself.
Well, that's the point of this show. Joel Caldwell, thank you so much for being on When We Disagree. When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. Reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.